I didn't remember much from the launch version of S.T.A.L.K.E.R Clear Sky. I definitely played it. I remember the swamp area, the weird new light blue faction, the addition of non-sawed-on shotguns, and the machine gun that mercilessly kills you 100 times as soon as you exit the starting area. But it doesn't dwell on me like the haunted labs of the first game. Sequences I still dimly remembered when I replayed it. I definitely played Clear Sky, but I don't know if I ever finished it. It released in August 2008, only a little over a year after the first game. The hype mostly focused on one big new feature, the use of their A-Life simulation to fully simulate several warring factions. The faction wars were supposed to play out in the background, with the 4 clans trading territory via tense shoot-offs, with or without the player's intervention. It was something supposed to be groundbreaking, or at least somewhat new. Most popular games of the time weren't running this kind of simulation as the main draw. The only one that comes to mind was pre-release Mount and Blade, back when I was grinding bandits in Zendar for 100 dinars a day. This sort of faction system has gradually evolved and snuck into a lot of games, but rarely with the player as a neutral force in the mix. And it felt fresh at the time. Unfortunately, going back to it now after some years have passed, well, to my tastes, Clear Sky just doesn't measure up very well compared to Shadow of Chernobyl. For a lot of reasons. Let's start with some of the big changes. Other than the faction war, Clear Sky added in a few new features that I now consider to be trademarks of the S.T.A.L.K.E.R series. The most notable addition is the reworking of the anomaly and artifact system. Instead of infinite randomly generated artifacts tumbling down the hillsides, we've now got a total of 56 fixed spawn positions for artifacts. Artifacts no longer respawn, so the first time you step into a new area, whatever spawns in is what you're stuck with for your game. After I finished my first run, I hit every spot, and there were still 6 artifact types that just didn't spawn into my game. Artifacts are also now invisible and require a detector to find. You start out with a simple hot, cold, blinking light detector. Then you can upgrade to a directional detector and eventually a portable LED map. It's a fun little minigame and gives pistols a more defined purpose in this game, since you can have them ready while you're hunting through an anomaly field. The anomalies themselves are also made much less obvious. Usually just the swirling of leaves or an odd glint in the air, and then you're suddenly trapped in a vortex. So there's a lot more bolt throwing to navigate those mazes. Sometimes it gets a little odd, as the artifacts can meander around the anomaly fields and get stuck in objects. It's a nice addition, but it's a bit primitive here. The anomaly fields are almost all just large, flat areas covered in invisible mines. I think it evolves a little bit further in Call of Pripyat, but I might be remembering some mod I played. Equipment has also been reworked in a lot of ways. Armor and weapons are now modifiable and repairable, so gone are the days of tossing out a broken rifle and scavenging a new one from a corpse. Artifact slots are also now limited depending on which armor suit you've got, but most can have 1 or 2 slots added for a price. There are still pretty clearly start weapons and endgame weapons, but you spend a lot less time with the start weapons. And damage has been completely reworked. Most weapons have very similar damage stats, so the decision has changed from a straight damage comparison to a comparison of accuracy, bullet drop, shot grouping, those secondary characteristics. And you can probably beat the game with any rifle, so long as you fully upgrade it as you go. Armor was reworked to accommodate this new damage system. Unarmored enemies die to pretty much anything, but an enemy in medium body armor will be mostly immune to shotguns, pistols, and SMGs. And for heavily armored enemies, you'll need to switch over to the comparatively rare armor-piercing rounds, or just sink 80 normal shots into them. Oh, and the night vision is much less awful to look at. Less of the weird scratching and doubling up. In Shadows of Chernobyl, there were a few scripted blowouts when the zone violently clears itself of radiation and kills everyone out of cover. But Clear Sky makes them a regular, predictable part of gameplay. These unscripted blowouts only occur when entering an area you've already been. It's an odd little punishment for backtracking in a game where only half the zones have merchants or repairmen. When a blowout triggers, the game pretty well screams at you to get to cover, and leaves no doubt about what counts as cover, since it marks the exact locations with an objective point. This was probably the most tedious part of the game. If I wanted to sell artifacts at a decent price, I'd want to backtrack to Sidorovich in his bunker, but then I need to spend 5 minutes waiting for a blowout to pass on either side of the area border. Any mechanic that has you put down the controller and go do something else for 10 minutes is a bad mechanic. But at least there's a limited fast travel system to save a few minutes walking from one end to another. Sometimes. When there are guides around. They also clearly put a lot of effort into upgrading the animations. Your gun carries a bit of momentum as you move and pivot, and enemies can now vault over obstacles, go prone, or take cover. They're still dumb as bricks, and even on higher difficulties, the main threat is grenade spam. Mutants are serving an entirely different role in this game. They've got some slight special abilities. The Snorks can now leap from buildings, and there's a psychic dog that attacks you with illusions. But mutants aren't really utilized to build dread anymore. They almost all attack in big packs, rushing at you in a huge wave. They're just another combat challenge. They can actually be pretty hard to put down with an assault rifle, but most go down in a single shotgun blast. And you sure can carry a spare shotgun. Clear Sky adds artifacts that can increase your weight capacity, plus suits can be modified to do the same. By the end of my first playthrough, I was hauling around a lot of guns. A lot of the changes are improvements on paper, but Clear Sky has lost something compared to Shadow of Chernobyl. There's only one brief underground mission, and most of our fighting is just shootouts with AKs against squads of enemies that might not even be facing us. Combined with all the territory capture mechanics, it almost feels like an embryonic Far Cry 3. And unfortunately, replaying it in 2024, Clear Sky just felt like a chore to get through. A mid-tier, quasi-military shooter trying to follow up on an exceptional horror game, totally devoid of the tense sequences and hard gameplay decisions that made the first game so memorable. But still superficially the same. A child in its father's oversized boots, trying to run and stumbling.
Nice to see you, so shall we talk business?
The faction war system barely functions. Factions will forget to advance, camps will despawn during a blowout and never repopulate. Sometimes you'll take a faction-related quest to capture an encampment, but by the time you arrive, the enemy's already dead and the quest is cancelled, like the game is playing itself without you. And when the wars do function correctly, you're often facing down seemingly infinite waves of enemies that pop into existence just past your view line. It feels like there was a real drive to pivot the game from horror RPG to military shooter RPG. But with the game remaining more or less a sandbox, it can't really compare to the tightly scripted linear spectacle of a military shooter. There are some pretty cool large-scale warfare sequences at the very end as we push through a monolith-occupied town. That basically plays out like a more polished version of the Pripyat raid in the first game. I really did like that section. It would be easy to blame the pivot on the breakout success of Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare in 2007. It really had a tremendous impact on the scene for a few years, but it's hard to know for certain. Either way, Clear Sky feels like they tried to make an entire game based on my least favorite part of Shadow of Chernobyl, the bullet slog at the very end. It's the S.T.A.L.K.E.R game that plays most to the series' weaknesses, downplaying the atmospheric dread and survival horror resource scarcity in favor of big dumb shootouts and ammo boxes in every camp. While the shooting being wonky was interesting in SOC, where you were encountering one or two enemies in a dark tunnel, it's a bit frustrating to use in Clear Sky's more squad-based engagements. and the game seems to punish you for wanting to take it all in. The longer you play, the more bugs seem to crop up, the more time you spend sitting in bunkers waiting for missions to pass. But a lot of the secondary mechanics this entry introduced are actually pretty strong, and the series is definitely better overall for introducing upgradable equipment and detectors into the mix. Even the emissions, which are just too slow and predictable to be anything other than annoying in Clear Sky, evolve into something better in Call of Pripyat. I think. It's been a while. The console edition of Clear Sky crashed on me 7 times on my first playthrough. At least none of them corrupted my saves or anything like that. I encountered a ton of bugs, weird graphical glitches, audio bugs, quests failing to complete, and NPCs getting stuck in pretty much everything. Sometimes nothing. Whether you think 7 crashes is good or bad probably depends on how many times you've played a S.T.A.L.K.E.R game. Moving on, let's talk story for a moment. Clear Sky is a prequel to the first S.T.A.L.K.E.R game, so there isn't much in the way of large spoilers here. And honestly, the story is fairly weak, lacking any large twists or particularly interesting characters. We play as S.T.A.L.K.E.R, a mercenary escorting some scientists when the zone erupts into an emission, knocking him cold. We're rescued by the new faction, Clear Sky, a group of researchers trying to study and understand the zone. They believe that the emissions are occurring because of a group intruding too close to the Chornobyl power plant, like a fever response to a virus. So we're enlisted to kill the S.T.A.L.K.E.R yet again. The story beats are fairly close to the first game. We bounce around on the trail of S.T.A.L.K.E.R, eventually hit up his stash, only this time we pursue the endgame through Limansk instead of Pripyat. The ending is particularly odd. I guess they remembered they couldn't actually kill S.T.A.L.K.E.R without destroying the continuity, so at the very last second, some kind of psychic Gauss rifle appears in our hands, and we have to use it to destroy S.T.A.L.K.E.'s psychic protective shield. I don't understand what earthly reason S.T.A.L.K.E.R or Clear Sky would have for not just shooting the man with 100 bullets. It works on everything else in the zone. I don't know. We remove his psi shield, then everyone gets hit by a massive emission, and everybody dies or gets brainwashed to star in the first game. It's a very strange ending. There's not as much world-building info tucked into this game as the first one. In part, this is because they removed the PDA's note-tracking section, so most everything we learn is through dialogue, and that's not particularly a strong suit of the game. I will remember the bizarre Ukrainian Rasta guy, though.
Give me 5, bro. What's it gonna be? A hard drink or a soft smoke?
S.T.A.L.K.E.R Clear Sky is probably the weakest of the S.T.A.L.K.E.R series. It hinges everything on the faction wars system, and they just aren't complexed or polished enough to carry the entire game like you'd hope. A lot of the systems that worked really well when the game was survival horror oriented become burdensome with this new squad-based shooter approach. It introduces a lot of features that I still strongly associate and love about the series as a whole, but they don't really shine until the third game. Clear Sky was a necessary but underwhelming step between the two games. On the pain scale, I'd give it a very painful. It's by no means the worst game I've ever played, but I do realize now why I skipped over it the last time I replayed the series. I think it's conceptually very interesting, observed as an evolutionary step in the series and gaming as a whole, since around 2008 is when a lot of major continuing trends started to catch on with gaming, especially open worlds and more survival-based shooters. I'm glad I replayed it, but I will probably never play this game again, and I just can't recommend it over the other 2 games. Sometimes it's good to play a game that just doesn't jive with me. I like to stop and consider why the game isn't working for me particularly. It doesn't mean I hate the people who made it or the people who love it, just that I didn't have a great time with it in the moment. And hey, there's games that I've loved on a Monday and hated by a Friday. All of this is very subjective. Anyways, that's all for my 23rd review. I've started a new corporate job this past week, so I might be uploading a little less for a while. But hopefully I can buy a new computer and finally review some modern games that are not retro-inspired. Dare to dream. Thanks for tuning in. See ya.
Come on, spill the beans.